All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in or listening through the replay here to discuss the role of Trump in the future of the Republican Party. Lucky to be joined by two great guests today from sort of opposite wings of the party, I would say. The first is Brian Morgenstern, who's now the general counsel at Wentworth Management Services. And prior to that was the deputy press secretary at the White House, as well as the deputy assistant secretary at the Treasury Department. And you can probably tell from his background, he's more in the pro-Trump camp. And we also have Liam Donovan, who's a principal at Bracewell Policy Resolution Group, and also was at the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and is more in the anti-Trump camp. The one thing that all three of us have in common is that we were all actually at Georgetown as undergrad many years ago. So we hope we can have a pleasant conversation with some differing views without being, I guess, disagreeable. So maybe with that, thank you both for joining me today. And I guess maybe I'll start off with first question to you, Brian. Sort of how do you view the ouster of Liz Cheney, from her position of conference chair by the Republicans last week? Do you think this sort of strengthens the Republican wing of the party? And sort of related to that, I know that there's a vote later today on the January 6th commission. So just sort of your, I guess, opening thoughts there.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, and it's great to be with you guys. I hope all of our viewers enjoy this Georgetown College reunion that we're having this morning. It should be a great conversation. Look, I think what you've seen over the last 4 years is President Trump really exposed some of the biases in the institutions in this country, in particular the media. I think we'll talk about polling data. I can talk about pollsters all day. Really, conservatives have been under attack, and we've seen it really, crescendo now with big tech, in addition to legacy media. Kind of put conservatives in a box and try to keep them down. And so I think President Trump really was, in some ways, a reflection more than a driver of this feeling among many Americans. And I think what we see is Liz Cheney getting her 15 minutes of fame by criticizing other Republicans. Of course, CNN and NBC and CBS will prop her up in order to do that, to further their own goals. But really kind of, training your weapons outside of school or inside of school, as the case may be, is really only strengthening the opposition that the Republican Party, particularly Trump supporters, see as so damaging to the fabric of America with limiting free speech. It's not just about tax cuts anymore. It is about culture. It is about preserving the greatness of America, our exceptional nation. It's about people who don't believe that everything in this country is racist. They believe this is still the greatest country on earth that offers the greatest opportunities. So it's a very stark contrast right now between the parties. It couldn't really get starker. And at the end of the Trump administration, you had the economy really roaring back to pre-pandemic levels that was doing so well because of tax cuts, new trade deals, and deregulation. You had peace deals in the Middle East, Arab states normalizing with Israel. We had energy independence. We had the border under control. Now we have the opposite. And it's because the Democrats are in charge. You have an open border with all kinds of humanitarian problems down there. We have gas lines. We have Hamas attacking Israel with thousands and thousands of rockets. It's literally everything was turned on its head. And so many Republicans, I believe, will line up behind President Trump because he has been fighting so hard against these entrenched institutions and made real progress, real change. They're seeing it all reversed. And when you have Republicans coming out and criticizing Republicans, giving fodder to the other side, who many view as, really a radical left at this point, that's just counterproductive. So I don't think Liz Cheney has a place in leadership in this party anymore. I think that's very clear, given that she was removed from it. I think the vote on the January 6th commission, I think President Trump said it, really gave voice to many people's view that such a commission would be sort of a partisan trap for the Democrats to just continue to attack Republicans, particularly if it's not going to look at any of the political violence that happened for 7 months last year on the left. I think President Trump's leadership of the party is very strong. I think it will continue to be. Obviously, we'll have new leaders emerge in the coming year or 2 or 4, but the president really harnessed something. He really started a movement, the MAGA movement, and it remains very, very strong today. So with that, I'll wrap up and see where you guys want to go with this.
Liam, I guess same question to you, and I guess maybe I would just add, we've seen some polls out recently that show, at least among those polls, that the decision to remove Cheney was popular amongst Republicans. And I guess, what does that sort of say? Because, I think a lot of these polls and have admitted sort of late that, didn't really capture Trump supporters leading into the election. So, I mean, should we put a lot of faith in these, or, how do you see it?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, I told Dino O'Brien before we went live here that I'm worried that we're not going to disagree enough to live up to the billing. I think the pro-Trump, anti-Trump formulation is almost not that useful at the moment because, quite frankly, the Civil War is over. There is no real internal conflict. I think Trump has consolidated the party such that somebody like Liz Cheney, somebody like Adam Kinzinger, they might exist as sort of freelancers that are out there, standing on principle or playing to the media if that's how you view them. But it is not a tenable thing to have them in a leadership position, particularly not a mid-level leadership position like the conference chair, where your entire job is just being on message. I mean, just thinking about how politics works, it's not all an Aaron Sorkin docudrama. It's not The West Wing. People are out there to deliver a political message to score points for their team, and if you're not on board for that, you're not going to last very long. Your job is to make your members' jobs easier, not harder. And I think while they gave it a sort of an old college try when McCarthy gave her a vote of confidence back in February, it became pretty clear over the next 2-3 months that it just wasn't a sustainable situation. The media wasn't going to stop asking her about her vote on and her thoughts on Trump, and she wasn't going to stop giving the opinion. So by the end, I think she knew that this was how it was going to go down. I think she was perfectly comfortable with that. In terms of her future in the party, she's kind of speaking to a national constituency here and not really doesn't seem to be playing to Casper and Cheyenne. So whether she'll be in Congress next Congress is, I think, an open question. But I just don't think there is a useful electoral path for anybody who positions themselves explicitly as an anti-Trump Republican.
Well, I guess, Liam, I'll start with you here. I mean, the dominant media narrative is that this sort of Republican civil war is going to benefit Democrats by dividing Republicans. I mean, do you agree with that, or do you see a case to be made that, maybe this purge will actually unite Republicans and make them stronger heading into the midterms with maybe a focus on getting out these core group of supporters?
Yeah, there was an interesting study that came out yesterday that was part of the Twitter discourse that actually discussed specifically this issue of how an open kind of public feuding and intra-party conflict did have negative effects. And so I guess there's certainly an argument to be made by nipping any kind of public dissent in the bud at this point in the cycle can keep those conversations, whether either inside the tent or marginalized, and it is a helpful thing. I think, most of these members, even the ones that privately would agree with Cheney's sentiment, if not her political instincts here, would much prefer not to be talking about this in an election cycle where a stiff breeze will give them the majority. All they feel like they need to do, particularly with the reapportionment and just the general kind of structural advantages of a midterm cycle, all they need to do is not screw this up. And so having disagreements about Trump or disagreements about really anything over the last 4 years is not something they want to do. They have to put up with it when President Trump puts out statements. They don't have to put up with it from a colleague and from a member of leadership. So, I think there's an argument to be made, not as a value judgment, not in terms of the merits of the argument, but as a pure political calculation. This makes sense.
Brian, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Liam's right. We may have a lot of agreement. I think what I would highlight here is the disconnect between the Republicans in disarray sort of narrative that there's an internal civil war, and focus on also what the Democrats are going through in their party, which is extremely troubling, I think, for the American people, that you have really radical left fringe elements taking over the party and acting as the voice of the party. And when you don't have a Democratic president really forcefully defending Israel, or forcefully saying, we're not going to be a socialist country, or really kind of pushing back on the AOCs, Rashida Tlaib's, all of this stuff. I mean, that to me signifies a far more troubling intra-party civil war, if that's what we're calling it on the Democratic side than the Republicans trying to decide whether they're going to get behind the latest Trump statement. I just think they're fundamentally different things, but the Republicans' disagreements are highlighted and put on a much larger kind of national media platform because it suits the institutions that, again, have been kind of really entrenched against conservatives for so long.
Well, sort of related to that, I mean, let me ask, since Trump became the nominee in 2016, I mean, how have you seen the policies that Republicans support, change? I mean, a few things that come to mind, maybe a more protectionist approach to trade, maybe less concern about deficit spending. And I'm thinking specifically about, Republicans tended to have more of a cozy relationship with business at one time. And that seems to be maybe called into question now, although perhaps business will return as we see sort of the increase in taxes proposed by the Biden administration. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, so I thought really a startling moment was when, for example, the Business Roundtable changed its mission from creating value for shareholders to kind of almost a social justice type platform. And now in recent months, we've seen a lot of large companies, a lot of corporate America sort of taking up social justice causes rather than focusing on business. That really is straying very far away from the Republican Party. That used to be, I guess you used to call them country club Republicans, and Trump really kind of transformed the party to make it the party of the working class. And now, for example, on the policy side of things, not only are companies changing their missions to be sort of furthering liberal causes, they also, for example, we have the Democrats and companies and high income earners aligning to try to get rid of the SALT cap. I mean, that was the thing in the Trump tax cuts that proved the lie that the Trump tax cuts were not for the rich. They were not tax cuts for the rich. That's what was always said about any Republican tax cut package, but they actually were not. The majority of the benefits went to people who earn between $20,000 and $200,000 a year, and that is in part because of the SALT cap, which of course caps state and local deductions in high-income states on the coast. So there is a realignment. I don't think it's over. I think that we're going to see things evolve very quickly. I think when I was learning political science at Georgetown, you'd have a realignment every couple of decades, maybe every generation, something like that. You had the LBJ wing of the Democrats controlling Texas in the 60s. You come around to Reagan in the 80s, and he's winning 49 states. I mean, just things changed over the course of decades. Now we see things change over the course of weeks or months. I mean, this past year, just in the course of the pandemic, our country has changed so much. So I think there's still an evolution that is currently happening, and I don't think my crystal ball is quite good enough to figure out how it resolves over the coming year, 2 years, 4 years.
Well, Liam, I guess your thoughts on that, and I guess this ability to maybe thread this political needle of still getting low propensity Trump voters out without him on top of the ticket, by also maybe trying to win back some of these suburban voters that seem to migrate towards the Democrats.
Yeah, I hate to agree with my friend Brian again, but I completely agree. I mean, Trump was the acceleration, if not the culmination, of the sort of sorting along socioeconomic lines that had been occurring between the parties, but he stepped on the gas, and probably, in some ways it was a peek into the future, look around the corner. And so, in terms of what that means, I do think it is fundamentally more working class, and that's in interesting ways cuts across traditional, sort of assumptions about ethnicity. I mean, you saw in Trump overperforming in 2020, his strength with Hispanics, particularly in key states, were a big part of how it was ultimately so close. Of course, on the other hand, why he fell just shy was losing in those suburbs that you mentioned. It was the hemorrhaging in and around the Atlanta suburbs. It was not being able to get over the hump in a few other places. In Pennsylvania, it came up just shy. Michigan came up just shy. And so I think in a lot of ways, 2020 shaped up the way some of us thought that 2016 was going to go, in the sense that he was obviously going to gain in the places that he did, but he was going to lose enough that it would be eclipsed, that in that sort of trade. I think the short-term benefit for Republicans is, as an electoral matter, that is incredibly efficient, and it's only getting more efficient in the sense that if you look at the census data and you look at the reapportionment, Trump states actually gained electoral votes. But in the long term, I don't know that this is sustainable. It is insofar as you continue to eat into Democratic margins with Latino voters, with African American voters, that sort of thing. And I think, the most interesting thing that people still haven't fully sorted out is how this guy that says all these mean things and says all these uncouth and politically correct things, how did he manage to win a higher share rather than the lower share that everybody assumes? Because so much of the assumptions over the last decade or two about the ascendance of the emerging Democratic majority hinges on kind of demographics as destiny. And so the question becomes, all right, is this something about the character of the Republican Party going forward? Was this something about Trump himself? Or is this just that these people like incumbents? I mean, George W. Bush did great among Hispanic voters in 2004. So maybe it's just they're more comfortable with incumbents. So there's a lot to tease out there, but I think it is an open question. And, Steve, you got to it. How you fuse those two things is the tricky part. And I think my take is it's not an anti-Trump thing. It's a post-Trump thing, and the people who are going to be most able to fuse that, take the mantle and fuse those two wings are people that aren't defined by the last 4 years and don't create their political identities around President Trump or where they were when.
So a couple of points on that, actually, because I think you raised really sort of interesting issues that will need to be resolved. And a couple of thoughts, things that I constantly hear from people. And one throughout the Trump administration was, I love his policies, but I don't like his style or his tweets or whatever it may be. That I would put as, a lot of the kind of suburban voters who were turned off by the noise. It was just too loud. We got to calm it down, which I wouldn't actually put as much blame on President Trump as I would the media. I mean, in the run up to the election, we had the suckers and losers Atlantic story, which was completely fake. We had the tax return story that he doesn't pay taxes, which was completely fake. We had the Hunter Biden cover-up, which of course was a massive scandal. We had, when Amy Coney Barrett was being confirmed to the Supreme Court, Webster's dictionary was changing the definition of sexual preference to say that what she said was offensive. They're changing the dictionary to make Republicans seem bad. But I'll get off that point for a second and just say that I think President Trump, his style rubbed some people the wrong way. The policies were pretty popular. His style also brought a whole new cadre of people because he was a cultural icon. The man is famous for 40 years or 50 years before he was even the president. That brought in people who were not typically politically involved to be interested in politics. I mean, the ratings of cable news were the highest in history when everybody thought the cable news business was dying before Trump came along. So there is something about his personality that brings people into the fold. There's something about his policies that people like. But then there's also an element that some people were not into it. So I agree that that's going to have to resolve in some way, shape, or form. I think in the coming years, the Democrats overreaching in terms of taxes, in terms of their climate change policies, in terms of many things that are actually going, in terms of people not being able to fill up their gas tanks, for God's sake. I think you're going to see negative impacts from their economic policies that maybe will clarify the coalition, and I think broaden the coalition of Republican voters to not be so focused on President Trump's personality, though he always will get attention whenever he wants it, because he's the best at that.
Well, I think you raise a good point that there were definitely maybe more issues with the messenger than the message, and that he definitely was an energizing force for both Republicans, but probably also for Democrats, which is why I want to ask, looking at 22 here, the congressional midterm elections, history would suggest Republicans, at least in the House, are pretty well positioned. They need 5 seats to gain control of the chamber, I believe. Liam, you mentioned, benefiting here from redistricting. Combined with these historical trends, I guess the one thing maybe that isn't a historical trend is President Trump still kind of hold and sway over the party. Typically, we don't see former presidents, necessarily disinvolved or looking maybe to make the election potentially a referendum on them. It's usually a referendum on the current president. So I'm curious, when you start thinking about 22 and also maybe a Senate map that could be harder for Republicans just based on who is up for re-election here, sort of how do you factor that in, and sort of your thoughts on that? Maybe I'll start with you, Brian, just because we
Well, I think that if history is our guide, the Republicans are very well positioned to take the House. I agree with Liam that I think the approach of Republican leadership at this point is trying to minimize mistakes and keep the coalition together as much as possible. What will need to be sorted out really is this kind of strategic choice. I don't know if choice is the right word to even describe it, but this choice of are we going to be the party that takes advantage of a pendulum every couple of years? Or are we going to be the party that tries to reform where the country is going in terms of the media landscape and big tech and cultural institutions, educational institutions? The debate over critical race theory right now is raging. Are we going to try to re-embrace the Bill of Rights and kind of true conservatism, or are we just going to be an opposition party that takes over every time somebody is mad enough at the other party? And I think President Trump put the fighting spirit in many members of Congress and many candidates for Congress. So I certainly think that is likely to carry the day in this election. As to how long that lasts, I mean, we've been around Washington a long time, and it's cyclical. And so I think only time will tell how long that lasts. But I think that in this election, kind of the strong fighting spirit and presentation of an alternative vision, I think, will probably be what happens. Whether leadership wants it or not, I think that's what the voters want, particularly in Republican primaries. And so I think that's what I would expect to see.
Ian, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on the fact that it's the midterm election isn't usually about a former president. And I don't know that it will be this time, but I think what's interesting is as you're seeing the Republican approach here, it's probably not going to be about this president either. I mean, President Biden doesn't make for the greatest supervillain. They'd much rather talk about Pelosi or even Kamala Harris than about Joe Biden himself. He's just not a polarizing figure. He's not somebody who's scary. He's easier to cast as sort of a useful fool that's kind of lost his marbles. I expect that to be, one of the themes, but it just makes for a different dynamic. It's not as simple as Obama bad and we're going to get a lot of seats off that, or Trump bad. And that's been the characteristic of these midterm cycles, which, as that last graph just showed, have been, swings. 2006, 2008, 2010, 2014. I mean, these have been big swings. So I don't know. I think Republicans they're so close they can kind of taste it in the House. The Senate's interesting though, because this is a map that they had done well enough with Trump in 2016. Actually, in interesting ways, they were able to thread that needle that you mentioned. When Toomey won and when Johnson won, they actually, they might have been helped by Trump in certain places, but they did better in the suburbs and that kind of thing. With some open seats in the places that there are in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, some of the open seats in redder states like Ohio, like Missouri, they're probably not going to shake out in ways that jeopardize those seats, but it's definitely going to change the character of the chamber and in a macro sense affect the ability of Republicans to take back the chamber. They're obviously one down, but they're playing almost purely defense here, and it's going to be up to people like Rick Scott doing the recruiting at the NRSC, which both Brian and I and you, Steve, all worked at, getting somebody like Governor Sununu in New Hampshire to get in that race. That changes the complexion at all, because instead of just trying to hold the line, you're actually playing offense in different places. And so I think that there might be a tale of two elections where Republicans make solid gains in the House, but they're still, coming down to the wire in the Senate and perhaps holding serve at best.
Well, let me ask you, Liam, because I think you sort of alluded to this about the maybe change in the character of Congress. I mean, you mentioned a few retiring Republicans. do you think those replacing them will be more in the Trump mold moving forward? And I mention that because if those people go on to have electoral success and win, does that sort of bolster Trump's, standing influence over the party heading into 2024? And
I mean, you've
conversely,
already
if they don't win, does that sort of maybe reduce his hold over the party moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, it could cost Republicans seats in those marginal, those kind of toss-up races. But I think to the point you're getting at, which is more meaningful and more of a long-term driver of where the party goes, we've already seen this in the House in terms of the incredible churn that you've seen over the last 4+ years in safe, deep red seats where the primary is tantamount to the general. These are absolutely people who, if not inherently Trumpy, have run as and won as people who fully support the president. And just going back to this point of the 1/6 commission and stuff, people have definitely at every turn, mindful of their right flank and mindful of their constituents, have been absolutely supportive of this president as much as possible. Politicians are survivors, they're chameleons. So when President Trump isn't front and center, who knows where they go, but it absolutely means that you're going to have a very, very different center of gravity in the party.
Sure. Brian, just curious your thoughts here over Trump and his ability to influence the Republican candidates in 22.
Yeah, he still is the most coveted endorsement I think I've ever seen. I actually used to not really see much value in endorsements until President Trump came along and was able to completely change the tide. He cleared the field in Arkansas for Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She's going to be the governor of Arkansas because he tweeted it. I mean, this guy has juice. You know what I'm saying? Like here in Texas, there's a race going on. It's now a special election. There's a jungle primary. There's the general is going to be in July to fill a seat, and people are stumbling over each other to be Trumpier. One Trumpier than the next. They know that he's tapped into something in politics deeper and broader than certainly any Republican politician, maybe any politician period in our lifetimes. So I think he is the kingmaker sort of at this point in this primary season. I think that will continue to be the case through 22. And I think it's his choice to make, what role he plays in 2024, if he's a candidate or if he is the, continues to kind of play kingmaker in the party. His voice is strong. He broke the mold. And I think the Republicans will have to struggle to find someone who can communicate as effectively as he did throughout his time in public life, and that he continues to do. So his voice is strong. It's going to stay that way for at least a couple of years until somebody else can do it better. But it's hard to imagine that.
One thing that struck me as Brian, you were talking, is the amount of lit I've gotten as somebody who lives in Virginia and who was a delegate in the Virginia governor's race is not so much how much of the lit was, look at me, I'm getting endorsed by Trump officials. There was some of that, but the cudgel of this guy's never Trump, or that guy supported Romney, or this guy's tied to, obscure Lincoln Project people, like the charge of being branded a never Trumper or in any way anti-Trump, that's almost more effective than saying I'm pro-Trump. It is fascinating, and it is something that's not going away.
Well, so Liam, you said something that was really poignant before, which is that this is a team sport, and it's borders on a contact sport with what we've seen over the last many months and years. And so a lot of conservatives are seeing Republicans who criticize other Republicans as tools of the media, tools of the opposition, and almost like traitors, to the cause, and as bad in many primary voters' minds as being a member of the opposition party. And at this point in time, unfortunately, many members of the political landscape in this country are viewing their political opponents not as adversaries or people they disagree with. They're viewing them as bad and evil people. And so it's reached really a fever pitch, I think, with self-selection of media that we saw with cable news in the 90s and 2000s. Now with social media and people's content literally being curated by algorithms that reinforces their views and reinforces their membership on a team, we're divided more than ever. And traitors to the cause are certainly not welcome in primaries. I don't spend much time around Democrat primaries, but I can't imagine it's more peaceful than what we're seeing in ours.
Well, let me ask though. I mean, it seems like you both agree that Trump will have probably a big influence here moving forward, at least for 2022. Will his voters come out without him at the top of the ticket? I know, 2018, we mentioned historical trends, maybe not as many there. Maybe that was partly to blame for the Georgia losses with, again, him not at the top of the ticket. Are you confident they will still come out without Trump there? I guess maybe you first, Brian.
I think they will. I mean, Republicans typically are more engaged on midterms regardless. But I also think that he will get back out and campaign and be a strong voice, even though he's not on the ballot. He does love to do rallies. He loves to carry candidates across the finish line. And he loves to turn out the secret Trump voters. You're showing some historical trends. And in preparation for today, I was looking at some polling data, and pollsters really still haven't captured the secret Trump voter. And so if polls are showing Republicans very well positioned, to me, that means they're even better positioned. If you look at, according to the AP, the 2020 election result was Biden won by 4 points. Well, the final polls heading into the election, YouGov had Biden by 10, Quinnipiac had him by 11, Harris by 8, CNBC by 10, Fox News by 8. These are double or 2.5 times the margin of error. So one of two things that are happening, or maybe a combination of both. One, pollsters still really haven't learned to capture a lot of Americans, or at least to weight polls appropriately to reflect their opinion. They really haven't learned their lesson. Or a lot of polls are meant to not to reflect public opinion, but to persuade or to push public opinion, to make people think that everybody agrees with a certain perspective. That happens frequently with push polls. I remember during tax cuts when we were at the Treasury Department, Steve, there was an NBC Marist poll that said the Trump tax cuts were wildly unpopular. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was wildly unpopular. Well, I looked at the polling sample. They oversampled Democrats by 12 points. And the question was, do you like Donald Trump's tax plan? Well, yeah, no kidding, it's unpopular, okay? So, I'll get off my soapbox again. Sorry, I'm getting on these tangents, but I'm very passionate. That's why you have me on this panel. The point is, if Republicans are well positioned in the polls now, just wait till the actual election, because even more will show up. They tend to be much more engaged than Democrats in midterms anyway.
Lily, I'm curious, do you agree with Brian's assessment, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're asking the question of will Trump's voters turn out without Trump on the ticket, and that's an open question. But I think I'd reframe it a different way. It's a question of the symmetry of enthusiasm, and while Trump voters turn out for Trump, to your earlier point, he also activates Democrats and people that are maybe sort of independents as well. So the absence of Trump, I think, is as important to Republicans as anything else, in the sense that if he's not out there triggering Democrats, and I mean, think about the last 5 months, and I can't believe it's been 5 months at this point, but just the crazy sort of, I mean, just look at the ratings of CNN and all the cable news networks. I mean, people who are, it was not normal for 4 years that people who had not otherwise been engaged in politics were seized up every news cycle, every moment on social media, watching cable news and that kind of thing. We're so tied into what was happening on a day-to-day basis. It's not a healthy relationship to politics. It's not a healthy relationship to your government. It's not a healthy relationship to your president. And so I think one thing in the Biden era is people have been able to sort of relax, to take a deep breath, to not be consumed with politics. And I think in a lot of ways, that was what was propelling the Democratic gains, both in 2008 and what got them over the hump in 2020. So if that's not there, I think that's good for Republicans, because as Brian said, there are structural reasons that in a midterm, Republicans should be in good shape. History favors the party out of power. I think the other thing that's interesting that's going on here is since Trump has been sort of deplatformed from Twitter, he's been contained in a way where like the crazy uncle can say his things into his like creedthoughts.gov, and no one sees it except the journos that care and people that are already, hyper partisan. But he'll be out there doing the rallies and doing things not with saturation level coverage that dominates the national picture, but he's going to dominate Republicans. And so you almost have the potential for the sweet spot of him not being the front and center for all Americans, but certainly being front and center for these Republican base voters that you need to get out to win in the midterm. So I tend to think that it'll even out and that Republicans will be in a good position to make gains.
Well, last question here, because I know we're running a little bit long on time, but I did want to ask, just looking ahead to 2024. I mean, personally, I don't think we're going to see Trump or Biden running there, but I guess we'll see if that plays out. But just, I guess, Liam, first with you, Trump's sort of influence over 2024. I mean, you saw two narrow elections. 16, he won by less than 78,000 votes across these states, and in 2020 came up short by fewer than 40,000 votes across 3 states. So,
yeah, and I think it's hit just by virtue of how this is all playing out. I mean, there's a shadow primary that would otherwise be going on now, and everybody's kind of frozen. I mean, there have been some things that have been going on in the background, and I'm sure private calls that have been made, but everyone is waiting for the president, and they've been compelled to say publicly, the people that we know are the most ambitious people in the party, people who have every intention of running in 2024 if they can, are actually saying, if President Trump runs, I'll support him, which is insane and becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point. If the path is clear and no one's going to stand in his way, he's going to wake up in 2022, 2023 and say, hey, why not? So, I think he's going to be a huge factor. He's going to be the determining factor in terms of what our field looks like. I don't think you're going to have strong horses among the sorts that are being talked about right now step in if he intends to run. That said, I mean, whether he has the stomach to, whether he even wants the job. I mean, I'm not questioning whether he loved being the trappings of the White House and that kind of thing, but that was a slog and a grind. And I think to some degree, it's a question of whether avenging his loss versus the being branded a 2-time loser. I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on that he needs to think through. But 2-3 years is a lot of time, and I think he's going to be a wet blanket on the field in the meantime, but he is absolutely the 800-pound gorilla.
I guess, Brian, your thoughts there. I mean, can you have a never Trump candidate without Trump running in 2024?
Can you have a never Trump candidate without Trump running? I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you rephrase?
Yes, I mean, could you see somebody like a Maryland Governor Larry Hogan or Liz Cheney? I mean, their thing seems to be, I'm running against Trump. If he's not on the top of the ticket, do they even have traction in a primary? Sorry, if he's not actually in the primary.
Yeah, they don't have traction either way. That's my answer on that one.
That's correct.
I think the president has been encouraged. President Trump has been encouraged by many to run again, and in fact, the perspective of a lot of supporters in and around the White House was that if 2020 didn't work out too well, maybe that is maybe there's a silver lining in that cloud because of the historical trends of Republicans then being able to be back in charge in 22 and potentially having momentum into 24, because the contrast between the two parties would be so stark that maybe it would position kind of the conservative cause better into the future, rather than having a second Trump term starting in 2020 and then having the typical second term baggage that comes along, generally speaking, with 2-term presidencies. So I think Republicans see an opportunity over the next 2 election cycles. President Trump, I agree, is the 800-pound gorilla. As to whether or not he wants to run, I think that's very much an open question. He has had a chance to take a little bit of a break, get away from the slog, play a lot of golf, and I think that's going to be clarifying. heading into the presidency, he had been a businessman and a media mogul and a reality TV star, and he's had a lot of projects over the course of his career. He may really enjoy being back in the private sector and being sort of a commentator and fostering the next generation of leadership. He may not be able to resist a fight. I think it's anybody's guess. I've seen him. I've been in the room where he's discussing kind of, his thoughts on the matter. He cares deeply about the country and wants to see it succeed. So I think, however he comes down, it'll be with that in mind as to whether he thinks he's the best person to run again or whether he supports someone else, maybe like Ron DeSantis or another candidate that's kind of up and coming.
Two things that Brian's talking triggered in me. I think there's two variables that we need to think about. Number one is, do Republicans have the cycle that we expect them to have? Because if they don't and they fail, that becomes another reason for Trump. Hey, that's his predicate right there. Republicans can't win without me on the ballot. Republicans will win with me on the ballot. And that might be the mentality of the party. If they lose here without Trump on the ballot, well, we absolutely need him. The other question is, who's the opponent? Is it a 70-whatever-year-old Joe Biden, or is it a Kamala Harris, or is it somebody we don't even know about? And I think that'll probably inform his mentality as well. And quite frankly, the question of whether people do step in and try to, not wait for Trump and maybe get ahead of the crowd.
Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that it is a binary choice in the end, right? That's always always a wild card.
I agree. And just for math purposes, I believe Biden will be in his 80s when we get to 2024. So just wanted to point that out. But I wanted to thank you both real quick. If people are interested in following you, Liam, is there anywhere they can go to hear more of your thoughts or anything?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at LP Donovan, and I'd tell you to check out my podcast, The Lobby Shop.
And what about you, Brian?
I am not that active on Twitter, but you can follow me anyway at Morgenstern NJ, or follow me on LinkedIn, Brian Morgenstern. You can find me on there, and hopefully getting out there more and talking about these things and helping out the America First Policy Institute, which is a group of us from the administration to try to keep the fire burning on our pro-job, pro-economy, pro-peace in the Middle East successes from the administration. So trying to keep that good research going.
Well, I want to thank you both for doing this. It's always nice to get together with good friends from the hilltop. So Hoya Saxa to both you guys. And thank you all for listening. And we'll talk again soon. Take care.
Cheers.